You know, every now and then in the stale, beige-colored halls of Washington, D.C., something extraordinary happens. Something so sharp, so real, so undeniably powerful that it cuts through the political noise like a lightning bolt. It's that rare moment when the carefully constructed masks slip, and for a glorious, terrifying few minutes we get to see a real fight. Not a scripted squabble over talking points, but a genuine high-stakes showdown of ideology, character, and truth. And folks, what happened in that Senate hearing room, ostensibly about something as dry as federal housing reform, was exactly that. It was a political cage match masquerading as a committee meeting. In one corner, you had Senator JD Vance, a man who carries himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who has read the first and last page of a book and assumes he understands the whole story. And in the other corner, Representative Jasmine Crockett, a woman who, to the untrained eye, might have seemed out of her league. They underestimated her, they always do. And that right there was their first and most catastrophic mistake. The room was already thick with tension, not the productive kind that leads to good policy, but the toxic kind that hangs in the air before a storm. This wasn't about housing, it was about dominance. It was about proving a point. And JD Vance, smelling what he thought was blood in the water, decided it was his moment to strike. He leaned into his microphone, a smug, almost predatory grin playing on his lips, and set his sights directly on Jasmine Crockett. Vance began his assault with a classic political maneuver, the concerned troll. He framed his attack as a simple, reasonable question about fiscal responsibility. He wanted to know why on earth Congress should approve increased federal housing funds for a city like Dallas, a city Crockett proudly represents. This was the what of his attack. He was questioning the very idea of helping her constituents. The why was far more insidious. He began painting a grim picture of Dallas, using buzzwords designed to trigger fear and disgust. He spoke of rampant violence, of hopeless mismanagement, of sprawling homelessness. He wasn't just describing problems, he was passing a death sentence on the city's character. His implication was crystal clear. Sending more money to Dallas wasn't an investment in people, it was, in his own words, just propping up failure. He was essentially arguing that some communities are just beyond saving, a lost cause, a drain on the nation's resources. The who was obvious. He was targeting Crockett, aiming to portray her as a champion of a broken system, a defender of the indefensible. And the how was through pure rhetorical bluster. He used broad generalizations, cherry-picked statistics, and a tone of condescending disappointment, as if he were a parent scolding a child for breaking a priceless vase. He leaned back, satisfied, believing he had backed her into a corner. In his mind, she had two losing options: either defend the failure he had just described or abandon her own constituents. He had laid the perfect trap, or so he thought. He had no idea he wasn't trapping a mouse, he was poking a bear. Jasmine Crockett let his words hang in the air for a moment, letting the silence amplify their arrogance. She didn't fidget, she didn't scowl. She just watched him, her expression unreadable, letting him enjoy his perceived victory for a few precious seconds. Then she leaned forward, and with a voice as calm and clear as a placid lake, she began to dismantle his entire reality, brick by painful brick. She started by acknowledging his premise, but then she flipped it on its head. She didn't argue with his description of the struggle, she owned it. She told the committee about the people in her district. The what of her response was a vivid portrait of her constituents' lives. These weren't statistics, they were human beings. People working not one, not two, but sometimes 3 shifts and still finding themselves unable to afford the rent. People living in homes with leaky roofs and failing plumbing, not because they were lazy, but because that's all they could afford. The why of their struggle, she explained, was the key. She looked directly at Vance and said his word, mismanagement, was a convenient lie. The real word she corrected was disinvestment. She gave a masterclass in American history, explaining how decades of systemic issues, from redlining that choked off access to capital in black and brown neighborhoods to a deliberate lack of opportunity, had created the very problems he was now so quick to condemn. It wasn't that the communities had failed, it was that the system had failed the communities. The who she was speaking for were the hardworking people of Dallas, the ones whose backs the city was built on. And how she did it was with a powerful pivot. She pointed out that the city of Dallas sends billions upon billions of tax dollars to the federal government every single year. They weren't beggars with their hands out, she clarified. They were shareholders in the American project, simply asking for their fair share of the return on their investment. It was a stunning reframing. In less than 2 minutes, she had transformed the narrative from one of urban failure to one of federal responsibility. The air in the room shifted. Vance's smug grin started to look a little tight around the edges. He had come looking for a soundbite, and instead he had walked into a lecture. But Crockett was just getting warmed up. The opening act was over. The main event was about to begin. This is where the takedown truly started. This is the moment that would be clipped, shared, and replayed millions of times. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just there to defend her district. She was there to prosecute a failed ideology, and she had brought receipts. She calmly reached into her folder and pulled out a document. It wasn't flashy. It was just a government report full of charts and dry statistics. A 2023 federal report on poverty and living standards. This was her smoking gun. The what was this unassuming report, but the why she was introducing it was pure tactical genius. She was about to use Vance's own logic against him, but with real undeniable facts. The who this was about to incinerate was JD Vance himself, not just as a senator but as a representative of his entire political philosophy. And the how was devastatingly simple. She began to read from the report. She told the committee that if they were truly concerned about mismanagement and substandard living conditions, they needed to look at the data. The report, she noted with a deliberate, slow pace, showed that the states with the absolute highest poverty rates in the nation, the places where people were struggling the most, were overwhelmingly rural. She started listing the issues plaguing these areas: a critical lack of access to clean water, crumbling infrastructure, healthcare deserts, and unsafe housing. She talked about the forgotten corners of America, places like Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta. And then, with the precision of a surgeon, she delivered the killing blow. She looked up from the report, made direct eye contact with a visibly uncomfortable JD Vance, and mentioned a specific county highlighted in the report for its extreme poverty and dilapidated housing stock: Ross County, Ohio, Vance's home state. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear a pin drop. Crockett let the name of the county hang in the air, a testament to his staggering hypocrisy. She wasn't just talking about abstract states anymore, she had brought the problem right to his doorstep. The what was the data about his own state, the why was to expose his selective outrage. He was so eager to pontificate about the failure of urban Dallas while his own backyard was, according to the federal government's own data, a hotspot of the very same suffering. The who in the crosshairs was Vance, and the how was Crockett's masterful control of the narrative. She wasn't finished. She then pivoted to his voting record. She pointed out that just a few months prior, a bipartisan bill had come to the floor, a bill that included significant funding for rural infrastructure development, for clean water projects, for housing assistance in exactly the kind of communities mentioned in the report. It was a bill that would have directly helped the struggling people of Ross County, Ohio. And she noted, her voice dripping with surgical contempt, Senator JD Vance had voted against it. The trap he had so carefully laid for her had just snapped shut on his own leg. He had been exposed not just as a hypocrite, but as a senator who actively worked against the interests of his own most vulnerable constituents while using them as a political shield. He had questioned the leaders of urban areas while failing in his own most basic duty of leadership. The crowd in the hearing room, a mix of aides, press, and the public, began to murmur. A few people gasped. This was no longer a debate, it was an annihilation. With Vance reeling, Crockett pressed her advantage, moving from the specific to the universal. She was about to expose the ugly, unspoken truth at the heart of the entire political conversation. The what was the fundamental double standard in how America talks about poverty. The why was to reveal a deep-seated systemic bias that poisons our national discourse. The who were the two Americas, the one that is coddled and the one that is condemned. And the how was by laying the two narratives side by side for all to see. She explained with heartbreaking clarity that when poverty and struggle exist in Black and brown communities like South Dallas, the story that gets told is one of poor leadership, cultural failure, and personal irresponsibility. The blame is placed squarely on the shoulders of the victims. But she continued, when the exact same struggles, lack of jobs, poor housing, failing health, appear in predominantly white rural areas like Appalachia, the narrative magically shifts. Suddenly, it's not a failure of character, it's a national crisis. Those people aren't lazy, they are the forgotten working class, the victims of globalization and coastal elites. She painted a picture of two people: a working-class Black woman in South Dallas trying to make ends meet who is labeled a failure, and a working-class white man in rural Ohio facing the same struggles, who is hailed as forgot and becomes the subject of endless sympathetic news articles. It was a brilliant, devastating critique of the coded language and racial bias that underpins so much of modern politics. She wasn't just winning a debate, she was indicting an entire system of thought. And to make it stick, to make it undeniably real, she brought it home. She made it personal. She told the room that she wasn't speaking from a place of academic theory. She was speaking from a place of lived experience. The what was her own story. The why was to build a bridge of empathy to show that she understood this struggle in her bones. The who was a young Jasmine Crockett, a child of poverty. And the how was through raw, unflinching honesty. She told them about growing up poor, about the constant anxiety, the feeling of being one step away from disaster. She then shared a deeply personal memory, the shame and terror of being evicted from her home at the age of 13. She described the feeling of seeing all her family's belongings piled up on the curb, the world looking on. This wasn't a political talking point, it was a scar. It was the wound that had fueled her entire career. She then connected her past to her work as a public defender. She told a story about a woman she had once represented. A woman who hadn't robbed a bank or committed a violent crime. A a woman who had been arrested for criminal trespassing because she was homeless and had fallen asleep on a park bench, trying to find a safe place to rest. Crockett's voice cracked with emotion as she described the absurdity and cruelty of a system that criminalizes poverty itself. She was showing everyone in that room, and everyone who would later watch the video, that this wasn't about budgets and line items. It was about human dignity. It was about the fundamental question of who we value as a society and who we discard. Vance sat there, stone-faced, his political ambush having morphed into a public trial of his own character. He had wanted to talk about failing cities. Jasmine Crockett was now talking about a failing conscience. And then she did the unthinkable. She showed more empathy for JD Vance's constituents than he ever had. The what was a final, powerful human story. The why was to prove that poverty doesn't have a political party. The who was a man named Ronnie, a 71-year-old former steelworker from Jackson, Ohio, right in Vance's territory. And the how was with details so specific and heartbreaking they were impossible to ignore. Crockett described Ronnie, a man who had worked in a steel mill for 40 years, a man who had built this country with his own 2 hands. He had done everything right. He played by the rules. But then the mill closed and his pension, the nest egg he was promised, vanished into thin air. Now at 71, he was struggling to survive on a meager social security check. He was choosing between buying medicine for his heart condition and paying his heating bill in the winter. Crockett told the room about Ronnie's pride and how he hated asking for help, but how the fear in his eyes was something you could never forget. By telling Ronnie's story, she was performing a political masterstroke. She was reaching across the aisle not to the politicians, but to the people. She was speaking directly to the forgotten men and women that politicians like Vance claim to represent, but so often abandon. She looked at the committee and said that the easiest thing in the world is to fall back on city versus country politics, to create these fake divisions that pit a struggling family in Dallas against a struggling family in Ohio. That, she argued, is the oldest trick in the book. It's a sleight of hand designed to keep people fighting each other so they never look up and see who is really picking their pockets. The real truth, she thundered, is the shared suffering. The truth is that Ronnie in Jackson, Ohio, and the single mother working 3 jobs in South Dallas are not enemies. They are allies in the same fight, whether they know it or not. The video, as you can imagine, went nuclear. It wasn't just a viral moment, it was a cultural phenomenon. It exploded across every social media platform, racking up millions of views in a matter of hours. The what was the unprecedented viral spread of the debate clip. The why was because Crockett hadn't just delivered a political clapback. She had spoken a profound truth that millions of Americans from all walks of life felt deep in their souls. The who were the millions of viewers who shared it, commented on it, and discussed it at their dinner tables. And the how was through the raw, undeniable power of her performance. Vance's team, in a desperate attempt at damage control, released a bland, generic statement about the importance of fiscal discipline. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. Nobody bought it. It was completely and utterly dismissed. Meanwhile, Crockett's office was flooded. The phones rang off the hook. Emails poured in by the thousands. The support was overwhelming, and it came from everywhere. From her constituents in Dallas who felt defended and seen. But more tellingly, it came from people in rural Kentucky and West Virginia, and yes, even from hundreds of people in JD Vance's own state of Ohio. People like Ronnie, who felt that for the first time, a politician in Washington was actually speaking their language, telling their story. The video's conclusion, the one everyone kept sharing, wasn't just about one politician owning another. It was about that deeper truth Crockett had unearthed, that in this country we do not treat all suffering the same. The debate had peeled back the curtain on the ugly bias that labels a struggling white man in Ohio as forgotten, while labeling a struggling black woman in Dallas as a failure. It was a lesson in the power of words and the power of empathy. In a follow-up interview, when a reporter asked Crockett what motivated her to speak so forcefully, her answer was simple, and it became the rallying cry for the entire movement that sprung from that moment. She said, "I speak so y'all don't feel invisible." It wasn't about her. It was about putting lives on the record. It was about a radical, powerful, and long overdue declaration that everyone's life, everyone's struggle, and everyone's dignity matters equally, no matter who they are or where they come from. In that stale committee room, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She started a revolution of seeing. Now let's just pause for a second and appreciate the sheer audacity of what we just witnessed. JD Vance walked in there thinking he was the main character. He thought he was going to star in a short film titled Tough Senator Grill's Inexperienced Congresswoman. Instead, he ended up as a background extra in the epic blockbuster Jasmine Crockett, the People's Champion. It's like he brought a knife to a gunfight, and the gun was loaded with facts, empathy, and a PhD in his own hypocrisy. You could almost feel the moment his soul left his body. It was right after she said Ross County, Ohio. I swear if you zoom in on the video, you can see his internal monologue just flashing 404 error, argument not found. His whole strategy relied on the idea that no one would check the facts, that he could just coast on vibes and stereotypes. Big mistake, huge. He was playing checkers while Crockett was playing 5D chess across multiple timelines. She didn't just counter his points, she dismantled his entire worldview and then used the wreckage to build a shelter for both her constituents and his. It was a political demolition so thorough, they'll be finding pieces of his ego scattered across Capitol Hill for weeks. And the best part, she did it without ever raising her voice. She used a quiet, righteous anger that was far more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. It was the calm fury of a librarian who just found out you dog-eared a rare first edition. He expected a shouting match, but he got a dissertation. He wanted a fight, but he got a funeral, and it was for his own credibility. He was trying to play the villain from a cheap action movie, and she revealed herself to be the hero from a prestige drama. And as he sat there, utterly defeated, the only thing he managed to prop up that day was the unassailable truth that you should never, ever underestimate a woman who comes to a political fight armed with the U.S. Census Bureau. It's a lesson he, and anyone else who was watching, will not soon forget.